Hi, I'm Michelle Shingler, the editor-in-chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning into Petit Foreword, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today we're speaking with Phoebe Greenwood, whose debut novel, Vulture, released on August 12th. It's a scathing satirical novel that addresses the Israel-Palestine conflict from the protected sidelines. Phoebe, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you, like Sarah, your heroine, have experience as a correspondent in Israel-Palestine. Can you talk about the process of fictionalizing your experiences into Sarah's story?
Sure. Well, I guess I should explain. So I was a freelance correspondent, and I arrived in Jerusalem in 2010, just a few months ahead of the Arab Spring kicking off, if you remember. And so Jerusalem at the time had to be the thickest, densest concentration of international journalists anywhere in the world, probably. Um, but most of them were staff correspondents with news organizations, big media. And as Arab Spring was happening, they left Jerusalem to cover on Egypt, from Syria, from all across the region, which left Israel Palestine uncovered, essentially. So that's where I stepped in, and I became a sort of floating correspondent between some major news outlets, mostly British. And so in 2012, when I was covering for the Telegraph, which is a quite right wing British newspaper, I went to Gaza just because things seemed a bit off. And the next day, Ahmed al Jabari, a Hamas leader, was assassinated and a war erupted. And I covered that for the Telegraph. It was my first full conflict to cover as a reporter. Obviously, it made a huge impact on me. And Vulture is a kind of fictionalized version of that event. And I wrote the book with my notebooks from that conflict stacked beside me. And I was quite meticulous about keeping the framework of the book, of the narrative, in the actual factual events, and then the very fictional, I should add, narrative came through that.
So Sarah, your heroine, she's brazenly ambitious. She's a young reporter among a lot of experienced and very jaded war reporters. Can you speak about what's behind their stories and your satirization of their war news industry?
Yeah, sure. It's funny actually because I didn't make a conscious decision to write a satire. I guess with the material, it just kind of came out. There's something very useful about satire in that allows you to tackle really dark subjects with a kind of lightness. And it allows you to draw characters and make them kind of extremes and sort of caricatures almost, kind of grotesques, in order to kind of deliver a point. I mean, I think other writers of satire have made the point that most satire has a thesis. And I guess I was making a point in writing Vulture, and that was out of a frustration with how I saw the media industry function. I had come to Jerusalem after being a freelance covering various humanitarian and conflict crises. So I'd been in Haiti after the earthquake, Pakistan after the floods there, several times in Pakistan, um, Yemen. And I, as a young journalist, probably quite naive, green, I was really pretty stunned and appalled by the way in which um, the kind of aid workers and correspondents who made their living and in a way their lives in these kind of foreign disasters conducted themselves. There was a huge kind of bravado and a swagger and a kind of overt sexuality and a callousness and a cynicism that I came to understand. But when I was first exposed to it, I was really staggered. Um, and then when I got to Jerusalem, which, as I say, was a kind of like this kind of concentration of some of the most senior foreign correspondents in the world were based there. And there was a new level of a sort of grandeur and a kind of world war weariness and a cynicism that I also found quite alarming, because what it spoke to me of as a kind of remove from the outrage of what they were seeing and what they were reporting on. So for me, that coupled with the kind of frustration I had with actually getting editors based in their kind of offices in London or New York or wherever it was, and trying to get them to engage, in what we were seeing and to give us some space. And that was such the industry just seemed in desperate need of scrutiny. And I it's difficult because I'm such a ardent believer in the importance of journalism and its function in democracy. But I do think there's an urgent need for self scrutiny if we're going to be trusted. And I think I kind of tried to set about doing a bit of that in the book.
Yeah, you did a fantastic job of that.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
So Sarah is also driven in part by a desire to impress several difficult men in her life, including her deceased father and her former lover. Can you speak about how those relationships motivate and shape her, and about the challenges she faces as a young woman in a field that's very much dominated by men?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I was operating in these kind of areas, in this kind of conflict zones and disaster zones in the 2010s, it was very much a male dominated industry. There were a lot of really incredibly talented, brilliant journalists who are women who I looked up to, Kate Adie, Orla Guerin, Marie Colvin. But there was something interesting about being a woman in those environments is it sort of became a sort of third gender. There was almost a kind of a defeminizing of the self. You didn't want to be thought as not up to the task of dealing with the violence or the kind of physical, grueling circumstances you were sometimes in that could lead you to be dismissed by male colleagues. It kind of sometimes, thinking about it subsequently, it always kind of reminds me of that bit in Macbeth, with Lady Macbeth invoking the spirits to unsex me here, to make her able to do these horrible things to fulfill her ambition. So the same kind of thing happens, I feel, with Sarah, except for also in her personal life. So she has her father, who's also a journalist and considers himself, at least, to be a much more important journalist, despite having none of her practical experience reporting in the field. And he belittles her and he undermines her. And she has a lover who kind of also patronizes her and uh, makes her feel insecure and manipulates her. And, in a way, Sarah is proving to them, as much as the people, her colleagues in the field, that she's up to the task. And, she's trying to fulfill their expectations, or what she thinks their expectations and hopes for her are. And ultimately, of course, that leads to terrible tragedy. Um, yeah, and I think there's something in that as well about how the personal can really impact our professional decisions when it comes to scenarios like foreign conflicts or some of the most vulnerable places on earth. Obviously, that can have really serious consequences.
So by the end of the novel, it is sort of clear that Sarah, who's ruthless, outwardly unapologetic about the chaos she leaves in her wake, and kind of salacious, probably doesn't have much of a future in the Middle East as a reporter. What do you envision her next step being?
That's funny, actually, because I don't want to how to explain this without spoilers, but basically, my feeling for Sarah is that despite her horrific misadventures in Gaza, that she feels totally confident that she can go out and further conflicts, and that's what she intends to do. And I think, yeah, and I think there's a kind of feeling there, like freelance journalism is a really unregulated thing, and when it comes to people from quite privileged Western backgrounds, often with a bit of money, going and flinging themselves into what they think could be a career-making news story, that can be quite dangerous. So, yeah, I think she goes off, maybe to Syria.
The Israel-Palestine conflict and the world's consciousness of it shifted between the time you started writing the book in 2015 and your publication date. Can you speak a little bit to the relevance of Sarah's story to the ongoing conflict and what you hope people take from it?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's so weird because when I started writing this book in 2015, it was such a different political landscape. And I wrote it out of this sense of huge frustration, having come back from Jerusalem and was based in London. And I just felt so frustrated that no one cared, that I couldn't make anyone care about what was going on in Palestine. And if I started talking about it, everyone kind of rolled their eyes and were kind of bored by it, or it felt uncomfortable, or I sound like an activist. And I mean, I'm none of those things. It's just, that there was a untenable situation. Um, And it was so far from the top of the news agenda. And so I wrote in this kind of sense of frustration about that and about why that was happening. And then, of course, and it was quite difficult to get even an agent to take it on, because it felt like such a political, like, oh, no one really wants to hear about this. Why are you writing about this? Why are you writing about this as a white woman? Why are, and again, to get it published, even more difficult. And then we did Europa, brilliant Europa, God bless Europa, took it on. And then 7th of October, and, it just seemed impossible. It was just too awful. And, to write a book that is a satire, that does have this dark humor, that I think would be quite difficult for some people to read with these atrocities ongoing. It just looked impossible. But then I think we got to the point where we're like, actually, maybe a work of fiction that sort of goes some way to explain how we got to this point might be a kind of helpful contribution to the conversation. And that is my hope for the book.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true for it too. So what are you working on next?
Well, so I was about to say nothing to do with war and politics, but actually that's not entirely true. Well, firstly, there's a second novel that I'm working on that is sort of very loosely based on the Aristeia, the kind of Electra, Clytemnestra myths. And it's about a family of women who kill men. Nice and light. Nice. Also, though, I'm working on a screenplay that is a Western that's set in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles. It's about the true story of a Catholic police officer who was shot and killed by an assassin hired by the British government.
Yeah.
And then also we're in early talks to make a screenplay, a film adaptation of Vulture, which I'll be writing, which I am so excited by the proposition of doing. So fingers crossed for that, everybody.
That's so exciting. We'll look forward to seeing and reading all of that. To our audience, Sarah, Phoebe. Wow, I can't believe I did that to you.
I hope people don't continue to do that. Different, very different.
Phoebe, thank you so much for joining us. To our audience, pick up Vulture. It's on shelves now. It's just fantastic. And we so appreciate you being here with us, Phoebe.
Michelle, delight to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You too.